Hi, I'm Linda Hixon of the Hopedale Women's History Project, and I want to talk to you today about Hopedale and the fight for women's rights. This is a presentation that was supposed to happen in 2020, in time for the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And I'm grateful for Hopedale Cable being able to do this presentation for me, but I kind of miss doing in-person presentations because I love the question and answers. I love the give and take. So at the end of this presentation, I will have my website where you can get a hold of me if you would like to add anything to what you hear today. The presentation is called Our Own Worst Enemy, 3 Generation of Hopedale Women Fight for Women's Rights. And this is part 3. The battle lines are drawn. Hopedale Women's History Project is my group. We are a nonprofit, and we are dedicated to finding and sharing the stories of Hopedale's women, but also of Hopedale itself, because it was an incredibly important town in Massachusetts history, and the stories need to be remembered. So we'll back up a little bit to the 1860s, after the Civil War, and the United States passes 3 emancipation amendments to the Constitution. And the 13th Amendment emancipated the slaves, gave the slaves freedom. The 14th Amendment, which was from 1866, sets up citizenship. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. 14th Amendment is rather long, and what they did when they made this amendment was they put the word male in it. It was the first time that male was used in our Constitution or any of its amendments, and that was done purposefully. This amendment was setting up citizenship for the freed male slaves, because the next amendment, the 15th Amendment, which is very short, from 1870, says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Male was put in the 14th Amendment to exclude women from the citizenship right of voting. They didn't want to include women in the right to vote. This right was given to male slaves, not to white women, not to black women. It was just given to white men and black men. And a few of the women's rights advocates, after this passed, actually tried to vote in the 1870 elections, and some of them were actually arrested for doing it often after it happened. This presentation is about 3 generations of women in Hopedale fighting or not for the right to vote. This is a picture of the Thwing sisters. All of the Thwing sisters seen here lived at some point or other in Hopedale, and a Thwing brother did too. They came from Uxbridge. I'm not going to give you right or left because I'm not sure how it's going to appear on your screen, but the woman at the top row kind of leaning in, that's Sylvia Bancroft. Sylvia Thwing Bancroft. She was the baby of the family. The woman at the other end of that top row, that's Hannah Bancroft. Hannah Draper. That's Hannah Thwing Draper. That was George Draper's wife. And seated in front of her on the bottom row is Anna Draper, Ebenezer Draper's wife. 2 brothers married to 2 sisters. And Aidan Ballou credited Hannah Thwing Draper, with helping George Draper to succeed. Called her a wife, quote, "rich in all the qualities necessary to match and complement his own. He has successfully risen to wealth and distinction." From what I've read of Hannah Draper, she was a force to be reckoned with. General Draper, General William F. Draper, who was their eldest son, spoke about Hannah in his book. Though her life was largely devoted to household duties and the rearing of her children, yeah, she had servants, she was thoroughly interested in public questions and never satisfied until she had settled to her own satisfaction the right or wrong of anything that came up for consideration. Though my father was a positive man, she was equally sure in her own views, one evidence of which was that though he became a member of the Hopedale community, she persistently refused to join on the ground that she did not believe all questions should be settled by a majority vote or that there should be no rewards for preeminent ability and services. Hannah Draper, a force to be reckoned with. Her younger sister, Sylvia, she was the pet. She was described as the pet of the household and a blue-eyed, red-cheeked girl. She was only 7 years old when she met her future husband, Joseph Bancroft, at least according to her daughter, Lilla, who wrote a book about her after she died, and then later a book about Joseph after he passed. And in that book, she says, we were impressed with the love and devotion that always surrounded her. According to family lore, as a 7-year-old girl, Sylvia was wrangling a cow, trying to get it into a pen, and Joseph Bancroft happened to be walking by in the hills of Uxbridge and helped her, and then said to her, I'm going to come back and marry you when you're an adult or when I'm a grown man. And I guess that's what he did, because they ended up getting married. She was also there when her father had his fatal carriage accident, when the horse reared and the carriage was toppled on the hills up in Mendon. And she and her mother had gotten out because her mother had gotten afraid of the horse, but the father's like, it's fine. And he lasted about a month before he passed. So she had seen some tragedy. By 1851, she and Joseph were in Hopedale when tragedy hit again. They had triplets, Minerva, Louisa. The girl of the triplets died on the day that they were born, March 12th, and the two brothers, William and Walter, clung to life for about 11 more days, eventually both dying. And they knew that the last child who died, I believe it was Walter, was going to die, because they waited to bury all three together. They knew that he wouldn't survive. Imagine that. Imagine 11 days of caring for these premature babies, knowing they were going to die. So she'd seen tragedy, but she had 5 of her 10 children who survived. And this next generation is a story about cousins. This is Anna Bancroft, Anna Minerva Bancroft, her middle name coming not only from her, the sister who predeceased her. Anna was born in 1853, but also from one of her aunts. And Aidan Ballou noted Anna in his History of Milford, which was written in 1880. He said she proved herself a successful teacher and is now one of the assistant instructors in the high school. So Anna would have only been in her mid-20s at this point. She will stay single. She will not marry. She was wealthy because Joseph Bancroft was successful. He worked with the Drapers. He was president of the Draper companies over the years, and he was a successful, wealthy man, and she became a successful, wealthy woman. She will own several homes, including her home in Hopedale, a home in Boston, and a home at Salters Point. She was a member of the Hopedale Unitarian Parish. She taught Sunday school there. She was the National Alliance president in the early 19-teens, 1913 to 16. She was the one who pushed for the Sewing Circle to become part of the Unitarian Women's Alliance. She belonged to the Alliance of Unitarian Other Liberal Women. She funded the children's room at Bancroft Memorial Library, named after her mom, who loved to read. She was the first librarian there. But Anna, during World War I, is thanked by the Public Interest League for the work that the Red Cross, they'd done with the Red Cross and the Sewing Circle. And that's an anti-suffrage group. So we're pretty sure that Anna was actively anti-suffrage. We know that she and her sisters belonged to a Milford/Hopedale anti-suffrage group. She had a cousin, and this is the second Hannah we're going to talk about. There's going to be another one. This is Hannah Draper's daughter, Hannah Thwing Draper Osgood. She will marry Edward Osgood, who was a politician and a publisher. She's the daughter of George and Hannah. She was born in Ware, Massachusetts in 1853. They are in Hopedale by 1854. We know that because her mother, Hannah, shows up in the Sewing Circle record in 1854. She's named after a mother, not unusual at the time. Women often named their daughters after them. It was a way of passing on your name. Hannah died in December of 1883, and Hannah the mother, Hannah the daughter, Hannah Osgood, at that time is a young mom. She's only, 30 years old at this point? She's got 3 children under the age of 3, including twin daughters, and her mother is dead. She is instrumental in the second iteration of the Hopedale Sewing Circle. They start again in 1874, right around the time she would have turned 20. She and Anna are both in it. Remember, they're cousins, basically the same age. And they're both in the Sewing Circle, and she is the one who encourages them to start writing the record again in 1881. So she's part of the reason we have handwritten records for 150 years of the Hopedale Sewing Circle. She was also instrumental in this. This is the ladies' parlor at the community house, built by her brothers in order of her dad. And her portrait hangs basically where that animal head is hanging on the wall. I do not know why. There were 2 animal heads in this room when this picture was taken. It's set up for summer. Maybe animal heads are the thing to hang on your wall in the summer. I don't know. Wicker furniture. But anyway, she's not listed as a member of the women's club that met in this room, but she was instrumental in making sure there was a ladies' parlor in this building. The Sewing Circle, the second iteration, shares information about suffrage off and on in the record, but only occasionally. In October 1907, they got a circular from the Women's Suffrage Committee, but they also had information in there about anti-suffrage groups like the Public Interest League. In 1910, Georgiana Bailey, who lived in Hopedale, gave a talk before the women of the Sewing Circle. The paper for this afternoon was on women's suffrage, and Miss Bailey presented both sides of the question in a pleasing manner. Now, the Sewing Circle doesn't meet in the community house. The Sewing Circle meets in the Unitarian Church, in a ladies' parlor there. And Unitarians, even as liberal as they were, are torn by women's suffrage. There's a Unitarian publication called the Unitarian Advance, and in September 1912, someone who wrote under their initials, KW, wrote a piece for that publication called For the Honor of the Church. And she asks, and I'm assuming KW is a woman by what she writes, why are the opponents of women's suffrage almost entirely the women of wealth, privilege, and leisure, women who all their lives have been protected by the care of some man, father, brother, husband from harsh contact with the world as it exists, whilst the great majority of self-supporting women ask for enfranchisement, ask for the vote? Well, it's not always true, because we know Anna Bancroft was a single woman of wealth, and she was anti-suffrage, but she worked, although maybe it was the wealth that made her anti-suffrage. At this time, in the United States, 1880s, 90s, there are states that are passing women's voting rights. They're passing laws giving women the right to vote. It happens first in Wyoming and Utah. They were territories at the time, and they passed the right for women to vote. Then Colorado, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Montana, Kansas, Alaska, Illinois, North Dakota, Indiana, Nebraska, Michigan, Arkansas, New York, South Dakota, and Oklahoma. This is all pre-1920. Now, the older advocates of women's rights wanted to go state by state. They said, we'll just keep breaking down the state doors and we'll get through state by state and we'll get the right to vote. The younger advocates, led by people like Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, wanted a constitutional amendment like black freed male slaves had gotten in 1870. They wanted this right never to be taken away because in a couple of these states, the right was given and then it was taken back. And they wanted that never to happen again. But there were a lot of women, not just men, but women opposed to women voting. The anti-suffrage women, women tended to be pro-temperance, so liquor and beer distributors and manufacturers tended to be against suffrage. So this letter appeared in 1913, which may have been paid for by the Macomb County Retail Liquors Association, Liquor Dealers Association. And the letter says, as women, we do not want the strife, bitterness, falsification, and publicity which accompanies political campaigns. Well, I think we all don't want that. We have refrained from protest heretofore, depending upon men to protect women from the ballot. We now ask the men of Michigan to defend us and vote no on suffrage. This is part of the argument to go with the national amendment because things got really ugly locally. There are several anti-suffrage books that I read doing a project several years ago, and it was rather depressing. Mrs. M.G. Van Rensselaer wrote a book in 1896 called Should We Ask for the Suffrage? The title on the side of the book was what was actually on the spine was Why Women Do Not Want the Ballot. So I think her question was answered. Are we prepared to throw into political life all the women, good and bad, intelligent and unintelligent, of the whole United States, including the swarms which belong to Europe but have been adopted here? Are we thoroughly, rationally convinced that such an innovation, sudden but irrevocable, would inevitably work for good? A lot of what she writes is anti-immigrant and racist, so it was really difficult to read. She also writes, and this goes back to the early generation fighting for the right to vote, no taxation without representation is falsely quoted now as a war cry for women's suffrage. There is no true connection, historical or ethical, between representation as our forefathers meant it and universal suffrage. She is correct. When the Constitution was originally written, the, quote, founding fathers didn't want everybody to vote. They didn't want the rabble to vote, men or women. They didn't want people who were not wealthy and well-educated to vote. So she's right there, but still. She says, women from the physically feebler sex, as they must perform the nation's domestic tasks, men do all the work of organizing and running the state, which means executing as well as making the laws and protecting individuals at the risk of their persons in time of danger, fighting wars. Thus to them is rightly reserved the duty or privilege of voting. Another writer in the same book, because it's got several essays in it, mostly from women. There are a few men in there. Mary C. Robbins, her essay is called A Few Considerations on Giving the Ballot to Women. She writes, the fact remains that this being a popular government, not government by the intelligent, numbers are what finally tell in results. If those numbers are unintelligent, the result will be unintelligent. 2/3 of the woman's vote is likely to be from the people who neither read nor think, especially the vote in large cities and in remote rural districts, and this represents a serious danger. It was very difficult to read some of these things. Grace Duffield Goodwin wrote another book on anti-suffrage in 1912. Again, a lot of her stuff is racist and anti-immigrant. Women are made exempt from the exercise of political responsibility in view of their duties toward home and family, which they are performing for the benefit of the state. Really? The ballot is not a right denied, it is a burden removed. And she talks about equal pay for equal work, which was an argument made by Abby Hills Price from Hopedale when she spoke in 1850 at the Worcester National Women's Rights Convention. She talked about equal pay for equal work. The question of equal pay for men and women to be secured by the ballot now enters. Men and women do not receive the, quote, same pay for the same work because every employer knows that they seldom do the same work. Well, I'd argue that, women tend to work really hard. Anyway, we know there was at least one anti-suffrage group in Hopedale because the Boston Globe ran an article in 1914 on it. Mrs. Frank J. Dutcher, chairman of the Hopedale-Milford branch of the Massachusetts Anti-Suffrage Association, will preside at the tea at the state headquarters in the Kensington building. Mrs. W.I. Stimson, and that would be Eva Newton Stimson, and Mrs. Grace M. Dutcher will assist, Grace being Mrs. Frank Dutcher, and that's Martha Dutcher's sister-in-law. Grace Dutcher was the daughter of Warren and Melinda Dutcher of the Dutcher Temple Company fame. Grace never married, but she was a wealthy woman. They're all members of the Hopedale Sewing Circle. We also know that there was not one, but at least two pro-suffrage groups in Hopedale. And we know that because one of them, according to the newspaper, met at the Braeburn Inn. The Braeburn Inn was a boarding house, so those would have been working women. They would have been women probably working at Draper's, but possibly at some of the other businesses in town because it wasn't always just Draper's in town. The other group met at Millie Patrick's house. This is the wife of Henry Patrick, who ran the two grocery stores in town. She was a wealthy woman. She lived in a really big house. She's not going to be going to a meeting at the Braeburn Inn, and she's not going to be inviting women from the Braeburn Inn to her meeting. So we know that it's both ends of the spectrum that are attending these meetings. She was probably at a big women's rights, women voting march that was held in March of 1913, which was the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated as president. Inaugurations happened in March back then, and there was a big parade that day. Inez Mulholland rode a white horse. She looks awesome on it. And the parade made Wilson angry because it kind of sucked the light out of his inauguration the next day. And Millie was there for the inauguration. I'll bet you she attended the parade. And the women marched in these white dresses. And they actually, it was a contingent of African-American women who marched because they were not always let into this process. And this process tended to be white women, and it will go into a third generation in Hopedale through Hannah Osgood, because those two twins who were babies when Hannah's mother, Hannah, died, were girls. And she had twins Fanny and another Hannah, Hannah Townsend. Hannah Osgood Townsend. Fanny was a suffragist activist. We know that. She's in the newspaper all the time for her suffrage activities. She was a golfer. She won many golf trophies. She was also the one who founded and was the president of the Milford Hopedale Amended District Nursing Association. Fanny never marries. I love this picture of her. She looks like a businesswoman. I think she was a businesswoman. I think more than anything, that was her calling. She took after her grandfather, George. And she was also chair of the Women's Committee for Hoover, to elect Hoover in 1928 after she gets the right to vote. That's her in the center of this photograph in the stripy dress and the awesome hat. She actually got a letter of thanks from Herbert Hoover after he was elected, and that's in the library, and I've read it, and it's very cool. Her twin was Hannah Draper Osgood Townsend, and after she married her husband, she moved to Connecticut and had several children. She had 5 kids. But she is big in women's rights issues. She works with Katharine Houghton Hepburn, who's the mother of, yes, that Katharine Hepburn, on women's rights issues. And she becomes the first woman elected to state legislature, the General Assembly of Connecticut, in 1929. How cool is that? And why didn't I know that? I grew up in Hopedale, and I never knew this information. Now, Hannah Osgood, the elder Hannah Osgood, the mother of these 2 wonderful women, we don't know if she was pro-women's rights. We have nothing from her that says that. But she raised 2 daughters who were. And she also had her dad's business mind, so maybe she was, we don't know. She died February 27th, 1929, of pneumonia. Fanny, her daughter, died that same year on May 3rd, 1929, of periodontitis, which is inflammation of the intestines, probably due to an infection. There is no antibiotics at this point in time. So she's only in her 40s when she dies, which is very sad and a great loss. Fanny's name will be listed on a bronze tablet in New York that was put there to honor over 70 women of the National League of Women Voters. She's one of 6 women listed from Massachusetts, along with Lucy Stone, who was a women's rights advocate in the 1850s, who would have known women from Hopedale. Lucy Stone is one of the first women who refuses to take her husband's name after she marries. And she was raked over the coals for doing that, but her followers became known as stoners. And when I tell my students that, they all giggle. Harriet Newell Green, who lived in Hopedale and married a man named Brian J. Butts, did not take his name after she married. And she was told her marriage wasn't legal. People would write to her. People assumed when it said H.N. Green on the newspaper that she was a man. She would later use his name after the Civil War because things became more conservative. But she was a stoner, which is kind of cool. In 1931, Hannah Townsend, Fanny's sister, put stained glass windows in the Arlington Street Church in Boston in memory of her mother and sister. I think she did it in Boston because that was their winter home. Hopedale was the summer place. That's where you went to spend the summers. And because all of the stained glass windows in the Hopedale Unitarian Parish, where they were all members, were already set at this point in time. They had been bought by Hannah Osgood's brothers for the church, so they were all set. And surprisingly enough, women get the right to vote in the summer of 1920. The amendment is ratified. And guess what? Anna Bancroft is one of the first women down to Town Hall in September of 1920 to sign up to vote. So maybe she wasn't as anti-suffrage as we think. Thank you for joining me for our own worst enemy, 3 generations of Hopedale women fight for women's rights. Thank you to the Hopedale Cultural Council and the Massachusetts Cultural Council for supporting this event. A lot of these images came from the Library of Congress website, which I suggest you look at. It's wonderful. Also from Bancroft Memorial Library and the Little Red Shop Museum. Thank you so much to them for sharing their images for this presentation. If you want more information, my website is hopedalewomen.org. I'm Linda Hixon, founder of the Hopedale Women's History Project. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.